I want to go over some more items with a vector, and to reiterate, a vector to me is much better than using an array in C++, because with an array the size remains fixed. And what that means is that only a fixed number of elements can be stored in an array. So if you know the number of elements that are going to be in an array, then yes, use an array, and that would work. But oftentimes we don't know how many elements are going to be in our object. So that's when it's time to use a vector. So this is video 2 of a vector, and just to go over that C++ offers the vector, and the vector is the object that we use to implement a list. Now, one of the advantages of a vector is that it can grow and shrink during program execution, and that's a really big deal. Okay. So what I want to do now is I want to go over just a couple more things with vectors that I didn't go over in the last video. And so I have our little standard template for the console application in C++ that comes up when we first start an app. And I'm going to go ahead and add a few lines of code that we need when we are working with vectors. So one moment, and let's do that. Okay, so I added the include string, the include algorithm, and the include vector. Of course, we need to have the vector library so that we can use the vector object. Algorithm is also necessary, and the string may or may not be necessary depending on what we're going to use, depending on whether or not you're going to use strings in your program. So as usual, I also like to add the using namespace std, and that is because I don't like having to retype std : every time I'm going to output to the console. So let's go ahead and add that, and we will remove this part. Okay. So now we're ready to work. I'm going to go ahead and remove this also because we don't really need this at all. We'll be working just in the main function today, and like I've said in my last videos, I like to return 0 because if you recall, int main means that it should be the function main should be returning an integer, so we're just going to return 0. It would work without it, but I think it's just good practice to have it. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to add we're going to initiate and add the vector with some words in it. So let's go ahead and do that. Excuse me, didn't want to do that again. Okay, so we added the line vector, which is how we declare that we're going to be using the vector object, and we have to say the data type of the vector. So this is going to be a string, meaning everything we put in here is going to be strings, and we're going to name the vector type data string. We could name this anything, but for whatever reason I'm going to name it data string because it's going to contain data and it's going to be of type string. Okay, and then here's how we populate it. We can say, okay, 1, 2, and 3. These are just strings that I've entered in here to populate. So element 0, element 1, element 2. Now, what we can do next is we can write a for loop to retrieve our information from the string. And so I want to do that, but I also want to do a demo on sorting. So to sort a vector is really easy. It's a really simple thing. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. So let's say we wanted to sort this, and we could say, okay, sort. You have to enter your the name of the vector, and the keyword that we want to use here is begin. So begin, it's a function, and I'll explain all this in a moment. Okay, so what happens here is we're using the command sort. We're going to say, okay, we're going to sort this vector named data string, and we're going to start at the beginning of the string, the first element, and we're going to sort it through the end of the string. So it's going to capture the first element through the end of the element, and it's going to just sort it in alphanumeric. And so that's going to work great. And the list will now be after line 13. The list is now sorted. Okay. A lot of times I like sorting my lists, and that works pretty good. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to do a, I'm going to set up a search so we can, I can show you how to search for a match using a vector. And I'm going to go ahead and type this up. What I did was I declared a new variable here called string word, and so it's word of type string, and we're going to search for the word 3. So in our vector we have 1, 2, 3. We're going to search for the word 3. But of course we're sorting it first, so the sort happens on line 13, and we declare the variable word. Now this is the little piece of code that actually does the search. So in the for loop, we're going to start with I, and I is going to be set to 0, and I is going to continue until it reaches the size of the string. So this right here is the keyword, and I did talk about this in the last video, but size, we need to know what the size of the vector is, so this will return the size as an integer, and I will continue to go until it reaches the size of the element. And of course, I will then increment for every iteration. So it'll start at 0 and then just increment up until it reaches the size of the vector. Okay, so the next thing is we're going to output whatever the string is. So we need to go through the vector, and we're going to pass it I, so 0 first iteration, 1 next iteration, up through n. We're going to concatenate a string, or excuse me, a space, and then we're going to concatenate the word, and that's just so that we can output each item as it's being sequential. You don't need this line. Line 20 is not required. I'm only doing this because I want to output each element as we search through it, and that's just for demo purposes. On line 22, we have an if statement, which we're using the comparator. And remember, the comparator means that the variable word, whatever is in the memory location word, we're looking to see if that is the same as, this really means the same as, if it is the same as what is in the memory location for the vector data string and then I, so in that element. So if it is the same, then this will happen. And what happens is, well, that means a match was found. So we will output the match to the console, and then we will break our loop. You need to break the loop because then it'll just otherwise it'll just keep going through the loop, iterating through. Okay, so we have everything we need. Let's go ahead and run this. And what we find is the first iteration is 1, and we're comparing it to the word 3. So 1 doesn't match 3, goes through iteration number 1. So that was iteration 0, now iteration 1. So iteration 1 is 2. Well, actually not 2, because remember we sorted right here on line 13, so it's actually 3 because TH comes before TW. So 3's next, 3 matches, 3, 3, match found. So because the word here is 3 and it matches the word 3 at the first element, element 1, then we have a match, so the match is output and the loop breaks. So catches here, 3, 3, and match found. Okay. The next thing I want to do is I want to demonstrate how flexible a vector is, because right here on line 11 we instantiated the vector and we populated it. Now I want to go ahead and show you how we can populate it using the pushback. So here's data string, the vector data string, and we're going to use the reserved keyword pushback, and we are going to add the number 4, or well, the string for 4. And so what this does is now after line 13, the vector now contains 1, 2, 3, and 4 for its elements. And so we could do this again, and let's see what happens if we run this again. Okay, so now what happened is we start with 4, since 4 is first alphabetically after the sort on line 15, and 4 doesn't match 3, goes to the next element, element 1. So that was element 0, element 1. Element 1 is 1. It does not match 3, so we go to the next one, element 2. Element 3 is 3. 3 matches 3, match found. Done. Okay. So now let's change the word that we're going to search for to 4 and see what happens there. And compile. And it's found right away, right on iteration 0. So iteration 0, we're looking for the word, and word is 4. And in the element 0, the element 0 is going to be 4 because on line 15 we sorted it, and the sort put 4 to the beginning of the list, of the vector list, because F comes before O or T, and so 4 becomes element 0, and it's found right off the bat. We have a match. Okay, so that's it for searching for a vector. There are so many more things that we can do with vectors, but for right now, I just wanted to do a short demo to show how to populate the vector, how to push back to a vector to add something to a vector, how to sort it on line 15, and then also how to search a vector on lines 20 through 29. And that's it. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I might talk a little bit more about vectors later, but vectors are so much more flexible, and they're what I use most of the time when I'm programming versus an array.